meeting of the Albany Public Library Board of Trustees to order. First on the agenda is public comment, and it looks like there are no members of the public here. So then we'll move to the consent agenda. So I have notes for myself to work through that. As I said in the email, we're starting slow. There's 3 things on the consent agenda: the minutes from December, the check register from the operating budget check register, and then the capital budget check register. So, does anyone want to remove an item from the consent portion of the agenda to discuss further? Okay. No? All right. I'll take a motion to accept the consent agenda.
I'll make a motion.
Thanks, Alyssa. Second, Matthew. Does anyone have any clarifying questions on any of the new checks in the register? Okay, then we can vote on that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, and that looks like everybody. Thank you. Okay, all right. We just did a consent agenda item. I think so. Okay, next up is the board reports. So first up is we started last month talking about how we've interacted with the library. So if anybody wants to, or libraries in general, if anybody wants to report out what they've done, presented a program, attended a program, anything you want to share.
Like interactions with the library?
Mm-hmm.
We've been to the library twice in the past month. Once, to get a passport at the Pine Hills Library, which didn't work out, but that's okay. And then once to play on the computers and play with puzzles and stuff at Washington Ave, which was a rousing success.
Excellent. Also, any events you attended as a trustee, that's also something else you can talk about. Yeah.
While I didn't make it to the art opening the month prior, we did finally get there to see the exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool. I like the woven ones.
Nice.
It's really neat.
Thanks. Anyone else?
In my work capacity, I was asked what we're doing to support the census and staffing, and so I sent Scott an email and said, tell us, what are the libraries doing around census organizing?
Quite a
It's
lot.
a ridiculous question to ask, because the list came back, extensive, so it's always a great day when they meet your expectations beyond you can imagine. Thank you for that.
And I'll share that I went to the Friends, Friends, I think they're still the Friends of the Albany Public Library, have a winter concert at the Washington Ave branch that has the select choir from Albany High School. It's fantastic. So I went up there and it was wonderful as usual, and got to see a few friends. Okay, moving on to the Finance Committee report.
So the Finance Committee looked at 2 things last week. We voted to approve the 2020 budget mod, or our stub year. It's pretty much 50% of the budget we approved last year for 2020. I think the only outliers was that, and this is all in my minutes, payroll's a little less in the first half of the year due to hiring spikes in the summer months, July, August for programming. So we're going to see that a little higher in the 2020-2021 budget that we're going to adopt. Periodicals and central library development are spent completely at the beginning of the year, so that's paid 100% in the stub budget. But other than that, it was really basically 50% of the budget we had approved in the past, so we approved that unanimously. The second item on our agenda was to look at the proposals for the 2020-2021 budget that Scott and Adam had come up with. They proposed two, a 0% tax increase and a 1.5% tax increase. The only difference being how much money we will plan to pull from our fund balance. So we went over that and we had a few questions that I know Scott was planning on looking into. We were looking for the tax cap number and what were the other things we were looking for?
Cost per household.
Cost per household, which is a number we're typically provided with, and I feel like there was a third thing.
The cost of how much money we would need for the 2 months between when our
Correct.
fiscal year started and September. We haven't answered two of them, but Adam has an answer for the tax cap.
I should have that answer this week.
Not a problem.
Yes, but our equation changes because we didn't go for an increase last year, and also the infusion of pilot payments changes our budget, and that'll have an impact as well. So that's if everything was copacetic every year. That thank you, but ours is going to probably go up a little bit compared to that because we didn't do an increase last year. So, and we have to wait to hear back from the treasurer's office about assessments.
I talked to them today, and I really expect to get the number tomorrow, so.
Yeah, I know you said there was a little holdup due to our stub year, so that I know is just getting worked out on their end. So, any questions?
And we'll go over those budgets.
I'm sorry?
We're gonna go over the budgets later and, yeah.
Who came up with stub year?
The phrase?
The accountants, right?
Funny. It's like dongle.
We're trying to change it to 2020 and 2021. And then we were calling it stump year because I think we were mixed up between stub and stump in honor of our budget manager.
It's
Stub
a
year is the
legal
official.
term according to the
Okay.
internet.
Stub year.
Yeah, stub
I
year.
changed it to stump because it's really
Portion?
Adam's budget.
Okay, any other questions for Sarah or other finance committee members?
So, maybe well, so are you is the finance committee proposing that we might have to ask for an increase in the coming year?
We actually didn't have a discussion or decide to propose anything as a committee yet. We were
Okay.
really just presented with both budgets and
Okay.
we asked a lot of questions and tried to talk everything out. You'll see in the middle of my notes for the
Yeah.
proposed budget the fund balances. And that was a large conversation. Like Scott was saying, we're trying to figure out with changing our fiscal year how much money we'll need during the summer months, July and August, to tide us over until we get our tax payment from the school district. So we just want to make sure that we have enough money in the accounts and we're just trying to make sure everything lines up.
Basic emergency cash.
Okay, next up is policy and governance, and Brenda is excused tonight. She wasn't able to make the meeting. Sarah Dallas, how do you feel about, you just said. Okay. So we reviewed quite a few policies, as you can see in the minutes. 4 policies we reviewed: employee safety, group visits, use of equipment and technology by staff, acquisition of art policy. We recommend no changes, so that we don't need to vote on those. There was one policy that was recommended for approval that had changes, and it's on the agenda, but it got on the agenda this afternoon, so it's okay if we can table that for next time. Public access to the library, not that one. It's public access to library records, I believe. It's public access to library information, yeah. So that one is ready to be approved by the board when the board is ready. And then there are 5 policies that are going to continue, staff is going to continue to work on. And the only policy that you have in board docs is the one that we could potentially vote on tonight. We didn't share with you the ones that are not changed. Sarah, anything to add? Any questions? Okay. And then a last minute agenda add is the Upper Hudson Library System Liaison Report, who has some really interesting stuff to report. So go ahead, Matthew.
Well, since our November 12th discussions, if you look at the document, I just structured it like a chronology of what's been going on. So, since our November 12th meeting, we had a pretty in-depth discussion about what our concerns were with Pulse having the loan agreement, where it pertains to user data, privacy, cybersecurity. The following day, November 13th, was the Health Board meeting, so I took this to the Health Board meeting. They were voting on approving the loan agreement as it was. There was an objection from another library about how the steps, the increased steps of how libraries are going to pay for it was flat, and they thought it should be a little bit more allotted based on the library size. So, and what the activity was within one. So that took a lot of the discussion time, and then that library was pretty much assuaged, and so I brought up our concerns. And the executive director, Tim, was kind of like, well, why didn't we hear about this before? And so we just really got to it last night. So this was when I invited him to come to our next board meeting. So the loan agreement, as it was worded and structured, was put out for motion, I was the only nay vote. I think we need to stop this because your biggest library needs to talk about this. No one else agreed with me, and the motion was passed, and the loan agreement went. Oh, we approved by the board.
Stop asking questions and pay more.
So, because of that discussion, Tim came to see us December 10th. We had that discussion with him where we were very clear and specific about what our concerns were. Thank you, board members, for all of your input that evening. And Ulls did not have a December meeting, so there was nothing until January 8th. So I put in this document here a link to some updated wording about user privacy. You can click on that link. This was approved at the January 8th board meeting unanimously. The new wording about for the whole system about user data security for privacy.
So I just want to jump in and say that at the meeting, we asked him if there was a privacy policy. He said,
Right.
yes, Melanie looked it up, and so there wasn't. We followed up, and it wasn't there. And so,
So it's new,
this is the
it's
new
wording, I guess,
new
that they got
policy.
from the state. So,
Okay.
yeah, so they're now putting this in place for policy, yeah.
And that was approved last
That
week.
was approved January, and I voted yay. We got them started. So, also in the executive director's report, he put out a little bit of a statement about what happened between Hulls and us, and I'll let you read that. That's public since the January meeting, and it talks about, his summary is that he's going to be looking into the security and privacy issues more because of this. So we've kind of pushed the issue forward.
It's great.
That is it.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Matthew.
Matthew.
Sure.
Yeah.
Any questions or comments?
I'm glad that this was brought up.
Me too.
Thank you all for raising it. Scott raising it with the P&G committee first, and then the conversation at the December meeting where all trustees participated was a really great conversation. And I think it made it really clear to Tim that this was a broadly shared concern across all the trustees and clearly made a difference. So
voting nay. It's not an easy thing to do.
I do this a lot at Ellis. This is not my first time. They're used to me now.
Okay, thanks again. All right, next up is the treasurer's report, both the treasurer report and the capital fund report. Chuck and Adam, is there anything in particular you would like to bring our attention to?
Talk about the deferral that we talked about today.
I didn't see anything that was really truly out of order. I tried to compare the month-to-month reports when I prepare them to make sure there's nothing out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time, there's not. But once in a while, something catches my eye. I didn't see anything this month.
Any questions about the treasurer's report? Okay. Capital fund. Pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? And I'm guessing since it's end of November that next month we'll be getting the preliminary end of year numbers.
Yeah, I just got the bank statements today, so I started on reconciling them today. It's gonna be a little hectic because the auditors are coming in Thursday
Okay.
to do some preliminary work, so I don't know if they're gonna reach into the December work yet. I'm assuming that they've got their preliminary stuff to look at as far as systems work and that kind of thing. I don't think they will be looking at financial figures, so to speak. I hope not anyway, just as I said, I just got the bank statements today. So we'll see how that works.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Moving on, director's report.
So let me just so in December, Washington Avenue hosted a 3-day census job fair, and the Albany Symphony Orchestra Vanguard did a preview performance. The Mother Goose Jazz Band performed for children and their families. At Arbor Hill West Hill, they are reporting an increase in chess club participation, which is kind of nice. At the Bach branch, it's been noted that there's an increase in Albany City School District sponsored tutoring for suspended students. The Pine Hills branch hosted one of its best attended openings for our art exhibitions, which are now done in partnership with All Pocket Gallery. We also got a nice article about us this past Sunday in the Times-Union about that show. The Delaware branch has noted also an increase in demand for tutors. It's working with Albany Med and Albany Pharmacy to increase their numbers. The Howe branch hosted a local children's author, Nakia Tillman, and got very positive news coverage for her reading her stories to children. And the North Albany branch also got some media coverage because they hosted a well-attended discussion about Albany's abandoned properties here, and this was a packed house. Again, just to add, on December 5th, YMCA staff were not present at the former North Albany facility, so the library branch could not open. However, a quick-thinking head of branches, Rebecca Lubin, reached out to a contact at the Capital District YMCA, and in that conversation was informed that the Y was no longer staffing weekends and that a secondary security firm had been hired. They contacted the security firm and the branch opened late, but it opened. Quick thinking, because Melanie and I were both getting Christmas trees at the same, not knowing we were both there at the same time, how you didn't hear my children is amazing. And it's a Christmas tree farm where there's no cell service, which I think is done purposely by my wife. So Rebecca was awesome. She reached out to a contact of hers, and they worked together to get the branch open, and she may have actually gotten us the back room as well in this whole process, so good job. Again, at this time, no information has been provided to the library about who to contact in the future, so we're going to continue to do it. Rebecca and her friends to make sure this branch opens on time. And amazingly enough, there has not been an issue since. Change to our e-magazine service, which is the entire system. We're switching back to Overdrive if you do magazines online, or if you know patrons who do it's very popular. We're switching back to Overdrive, and we're decreasing our Flipster titles. That's part of Upper Hudson. That's not a decision of ours, but a decision of the committee I sit on. Some other notes in December, I was the host of Albany's TEDx. I was no Benita's on, but I think I made it through and I enjoyed doing it. And then I testified in front of the State Assembly's Library Committee, and that's included in board docs. A little bit of history, because I've been talking about us looking back at our history with 2003 being our 100-year anniversary. Like all of America, the events of September 11th had a significant, we're doing 2001, had a significant impact on the Albany Public Library. The library closed all its locations early that day, and in a showing of solidarity, used that all locations banded together to make 1,000 paper crayons to be sent to the New York Public Library. 2001 also marked the year where the library officially began to explore rechartering by creating an exploratory committee of the board. Several branches received computers via the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and that was a game changer. So much so that the staff reported that the main library was dealing with an unprecedented increase in young patrons since offering internet access, which I thought was an interesting note. The public also got a brief preview of the Cybermobile, which was later renamed the Bookmobile. Action items, the Upper Hudson Library Agreement was signed and hand-delivered to the Executive Director of Upper Hudson, and then CSEA APL Healthcare MOU was signed as well. I'll open the floor to questions.
The first paragraph on the first page, last sentence, what do you mean by the branch has also been actively merchandising parts of the collection to increase circulation?
So, book displays, which were very popular with libraries years ago. Libraries, for some reason, moved away from it, and it's becoming popular again. There's a lot of webinars. And we're trying that as our new way to maybe increase circulation. The Arbor Hill branch, the Howe branch has always done an amazing job of it. Delaware does an amazing job of it, and Arbor Hill, after the branch manager went to a webinar about it, if you go through that branch now, you'll really see that that resonated with her as well. I know that the Washington Avenue staff were right outside my office watching the same web presentation, and I know they're starting to think about doing it differently. So the idea is to get people to see the collection in new ways, and also it's a great way to kind of co-market other things we do, like Howe did a really great one where Kim came. They actually did a great display on the history of hip hop and all of our history of hip hop books. And some of those books moved because people were in the building, were interested in Rakim, and they decided that, hey, I'm going to grab a book while I'm here.
Nice.
I think it's something like 80% of all circulations are books that people weren't looking for.
Yes. And face outs work really, really well. I know at Bach, I don't ever walk out of that branch without a face-out book. So.
Any other questions? All right, thank you. Oh, stats.
Stats. So we had a lackluster early winter. I think some of that had to do with the weather and a couple closures. However, outside of circulation, which decreased, except for e-media, which saw a 17% increase. Programming saw a 17% increase compared to the previous year, and a 21% increase compared to the 3-year average. That's unprecedented. I mean, I don't think we've ever had an increase in program numbers like that. And again, we look at these numbers and we realize that this is really the strength of the library and where we need to put resources. Door count saw a 3% increase compared to the last year, and a 5% increase compared to the 5-year average. Room use saw a 9% increase compared to the last year, and 11% increase compared to the 3-year average, which was interesting because we actually expected a decrease because so much programming was going on. Computer usage actually saw a 2% decrease, and a 13% decrease compared to the 3-year average, which was interesting to us because last year we saw a really big boost. So we're trying to figure out, we know that having less computers at the Washington Avenue branch definitely impacted us, and that's why we're having a discussion of maybe we actually need more computers at the Washington Avenue branch, because a huge drop had to do with when those 4 or 5 computers were out for a month or two. So really is making us rethink Washington Avenue. Wireless did go up by 3%. I think the majority of that is the Wi-Fi in the parks that were launched. So that's a nice thing. Reference a 19% increase compared to the last year and a 34% increase compared to the 3-year average. I really attribute that to some people staff internally, looking at reference a little bit more closely and maybe better reporting it. But I also have talked to other directors who have noticed there's an increase in reference questions. Some of it's digital literacy questions, but some of it is just the internet is a mess and they're looking for trusted sources again in the library. We're getting more like phone calls asking like general questions than we've gotten in the past. So we might see a resurgence in a former service that was a bread and butter. Maybe it's coming back to be a bread and butter service.
Is it also because you moved it downstairs?
No, because this is district wide, and actually the branch that's leading a lot of this is Pine Hills.
Actually, when I was at Pine Hills, the reference librarian was helping 3 people at once.
So we have discussed how that branch has taken on more of a main library feel to it. So we have added more staff there. We're making sure that the reference has enough support, and we actually got more shelving because we actually want to increase the collection there, especially the nonfiction collection, considering it's in a higher ed cluster. There's 3 to 4 universities, schools in that general area, and it would, from observing the clientele and talking to staff, that's really starting to go in that direction. So, we're hoping that's weather and closures that cause this drop, and, we'll see as the next year progresses.
Are these numbers annual averages, not December, month of December?
This is year to date.
Would you have your virtual visits to the library?
So yeah, we'll report them when we do the annual report. We would definitely share with this group how many website visits we got, what our social media engagement was.
So we could still be getting a lot of visitors, but just in a
Absolutely,
different way.
absolutely. We're thinking differently about how we're going to report. You'll notice that this is different than what you get, in the annual report. We're trying to figure out some metrics that we can create. Like we just had Upper Hudson create a report. One thing that I want to look at is how many circulation interactions we're having, as opposed to how many books are going out the door. How many times are our staff interacting with patrons? Because what some of our clerks have come back and told us is that they're just as busy, it's just people don't get out the giant pile of things anymore, and now it's either books or 1 or 2 DVDs. So we're trying to figure out, with that, combining it with what we do in terms of CDTA business, Yonkers has a metric that I think is interesting. How do we come up with a metric that kind of shows overall busyness of the staff while they're in the building? Because really these numbers are important to help us with operation, making decisions about hours, staffing, and resource allocation.
We actually did just a quick scan since it's a brand new report. We wanted to pull some numbers really quick, and compared to last year, we did 500 extra transactions this year as compared to 2018. So individual transactions, we are busier in that sense.
So our old metrics may not always tell the story as well as we would like it to. So we're trying to figure out new ways, because from observation and from staff feedback, Karen sent me a picture this morning of the line in front of the building. So we know we're busy and we know we're full. So we're not sure if the traditional way of us showing success, those outputs are necessarily reflective of modern library use, but that's why I think programming is so important, because it really does show where that success is.
When you think about people's free time, unfortunately, they're saying the unemployment rate has gone down, but it's because people are working 3 or 4 jobs. So their free time to read books or to ingest media has obviously gone down. So we might be busy, but people are, like you said, instead of checking out the 3 or 4 books that they're going to read at home, they might be lucky to read 1.
That 8 hours for play has disappeared.
Just tagging along with this, and especially being kind of excited about reviving a classic service with the reference service coming back. How is Reader's Advisory captured, or is there a plan?
It's in reference, typically that's a reference question, but we have talked a lot about Reader's Advisory and the importance of it, and I know Melanie is looking at some databases to be supportive, and with the change towards centralized collection development, what we've been trying to get our librarians to kind of embrace or have buy-in on is, if you're not doing collection development, this means you should be concentrating on Reader's Advisory, and that's what's really important, and that's why the marketing piece, that's a part of Reader's Advisory, so that's great to see that. So that's our hope is, and it's not easy because Albany Public Library tried to do this change like 15 years ago and it wasn't successful. So we're trying to do something we tried to do before. So we already have some, there's built-in cultural pushback. But it's really an understanding of how libraries our size operate, which is, it's about not buying the book for the building. It's about when the book is on the shelf, selling the book to the patron because they're in the door.
And a lot of Reader's Advisory doesn't happen at the reference desk. Sure.
Circ desk, yes. And so we also have talked about, at our smaller branches, it's easier to record that. At our circulation branch like Washington Avenue or even Pine Hills, it's so busy they don't always record those. So there's antiquated ways to do it, which I like the clicker buttons, but we'll get there, because I do want to try to get reference. If we're going to record it and we're going to report it out, as this board requested, I want it to be as accurate as possible.
And so for us non-librarians, Reader's Advisory,
Recommend book.
Recommending books.
oh, okay,
I like Cowboys.
Yeah,
Have you read Dune?
Yes.
yeah,
okay.
this one is great, try this one.
Oh, if you're checking out Rosie Rivera Engineer, maybe you should try Geek Architect. My kid loves them.
Sorry,
So the last piece of the stats report, incidents saw a 45% increase
Yes.
compared to last year and a 29% increase compared to the 3-year average. I know typically when you see a high percentage, it's typically because you're working with a small number of, incidents or whatever the case may be. So I just want to make sure that it's a small number of incidents and not something, that's happening every other day that we should be.
I would say it's the majority of these were earlier in the first 2 quarters.
Do you have a ballpark number how many incidents we're talking?
Melanie can pull it up.
Maybe a couple minutes.
Yeah.
No,
But
that's
it
a
looks
good
like
question.
it was Arbor Hill.
So most of them were Howe and Arbor Hill, which we had a special meeting about, but we also saw an increase at Washington Avenue. Howe and Arbor Hill is mostly youth, and our staff are trained to how to mitigate those issues. Washington Avenue is why we hired our CSS and why we've done a major change to our loss of library privilege process, and also why we've been doing a lot of de-escalation training.
And I kind of have another question that goes with this. What are we considering an incident? So what level does it have to rise to be considered in this data?
If someone is breaking a policy,
Okay.
so if you
And that can be as mild as, what would you say the lowest form of an incident is?
typically if someone has to be addressed a second time,
Okay.
so in other words, if you're eating food at this table and Rita walks up and goes, you know what, you can't eat here, then you put the food away and everybody's fine and no incident report's written. If you make a comment back to the staff member that breaks the policy, any kind of language that's harassing, or if you just continue with it and you have to be spoken to a second time, that'll usually end up with an incident report.
And do you guys, sorry, this is jogging more questions.
That's okay.
Do you break out incidents by type? So
Yes.
a pie chart and how many times it's just someone being talked to about food
Yes.
versus the more serious things? Okay.
Yes. And we can start reporting all that. We have it was part of my goals for this year was to kind of reestablish, we had actually been doing some things that may not have been Bob would say would not be the correct way to do things, so I did a deep dive. It's why I went to ALA, it's why I went to the directors conference for for LJ, Library Journal, American Library Association conference, and to really do a deep dive because they had trainings on this subject matter, and we're now helping a system with some of these questions.
So, in 2019, and we do apologize, there was a little hiccup in the middle of the year because we were changing the way we were recording the stats, so this number's probably maybe 20 off at the most. talk about incidents, we're not just talking about the fights.
Right,
or
right.
drug overdoses, but we're talking about the kids whose bike got stolen, or the person who had a heart attack in the library, or, you know, had a mental health breakdown. We just had an incident the other day where a woman came in and said, I don't know who I am, and stuff of that nature. So it's not always the stuff that's problematic as a argument, or I mean, it's sometimes just the reality of being a public building.
Something out of the ordinary happened that you want to record.
And it could even, I mean, and these are even some guy yelled at me today, which unfortunately happens, and we don't like it to happen, but it's not, it doesn't, it's more of a record for us, so we have
So,
pattern of behavior. should
yeah,
it
and
happen again.
it helps us, we see, if we, you know, the community support specialist sees these reports, our facilities manager sees these reports, so if it's something that, you know, Adam might come to me and be like, I think this is a building issue, so he's linked in, Annie and I will have a conversation every week and say, wow, we saw this name 3 times, let's reach out to the branch manager and the head of branches and see, is there something else we can do here to mitigate this issue, especially if it's youth. We also have where we will after we talk to staff, then we'll actually reach out to the patron and Annie will suggest a meeting or say, hey, can I assist you in one way or another? It also informs whether or not we revoke library privileges. So if we see 3 times this person continues this behavior, has a pattern of breaking policy, then they receive a letter saying, you know, you have lost library privileges for a month, 3 months, 6 months, and this is why. You can be reinstated right away, you just have to come and sit down and talk with us. It's an appeals process, which they have to have.
Is that a policy?
No, but, well, it is in our policy, the appeals process is in the policy.
Okay.
We can do a deep dive for the next board meeting. If you wanted statistical analysis of what we saw in 2019 and what was different.
I mean, I don't want to add something. I was just curious about that. I think you guys pretty well covered it.
If there's a recommendation that you have. Or if it's reflected in our budget, then we'll hear about it later.
Well, we continue to add community engagement clerks. And again, at a governance level, it's very, very important everybody here when they speak to their common council members, remind the common council members that we were once a very important part of the NUU unit and that relationship has fallen off a little. And that the administration is trying really hard to reinvigorate that. Melanie and Rebecca are going to the new beat police officer training tomorrow for an hour and presenting on the library.
Would it be helpful for, if we were so inclined to just send out some messages as citizens of the city and members of this board?
Just remind them that the library is a open forum, community space, one of the few that the city has, and that we have, you know, 1 million people come through our doors in a year, and that it is always helpful when there's a good relationship between the police force and the library.
Jenna, since you're typing that, feel free to share it with the rest of the board. You can do with it what you choose. But the behavior modification, behavior thing, is that a procedure for the policy that exists
It's a
that you're
procedure for the
developing?
policy
Okay, so
that
would it be
exists.
appropriate for the board to see it?
Yes, once it's done, I would say
You're
right
still
now it's in
working on it.
draft and we're
Okay.
still working on it.
Okay,
However, we can definitely present it to the board.
okay, thanks. Didn't know it exists because that.
It's new and we're making sure that it works because there was 3 components. Making sure staff were supported and heard,
Yeah.
making sure that we were responsive, which was some of the issues where some of our turnaround time lagged, and making sure that it's fair and equitable across the board, and also the fact that we're working on it's not about being punitive, it's about helping people stay within the library policy. And then additionally, we're working on the Hal branch is, I have lost the term.
Restorative.
we're doing a restorative practice at the Hal branch as a pilot to see if we can do it district. So we have a bunch of irons in the fire, and it's improving, but I don't want to present it to the board until we know we have a pretty solid blueprint.
That's fine. Thank you. Okay, so next on the agenda is the strategic plan, and the intent there was to talk about the board portion of the strategic plan, and I didn't prepare for it. So we will move that to the next meeting, and I would love to have a volunteer who will take a look at the board part of the strategic plan and lead a discussion next month. Ta-da! Yes, thank you so much.
I'll do it.
Thank
Give
you.
myself an email right
And if you want to talk about what piece, you can totally decide, but if you want to talk about what piece, feel free to.
now. Yeah, that would be useful.
Great, all right, on to new business. Budget Mod 2020. Sounds like a really great event.
All right, well, I can discuss that a little bit. Sarah sort of gave a good summary of what we talked about. As you can see, the expenditures are roughly 50% of what we had in the initial 2020 budget. And most of the numbers are based on 2019 spending trends. Some of the lines that you can see, the entirety of the 2020 budget is used. Those are expenses that we made in the year. There are some new lines, as you may have noticed. The only new line that wasn't factored in at all previously is tax cert payments, which is under the administrative and miscellaneous section. Just recommend to us that we set aside $50,000 for that purpose for stuff.
Tax cert payments. Is that tax certification payment?
Certiorari.
Bob, can you address that?
So when a property owner grieves their assessment, there's a two-step process. The first is an administrative process that they basically ask the assessor and then the Board of Assessment review to look at their assessment and say, you know, it's correct, it's not, the right exemptions exist, it's not. If that is denied, they have a right to a court proceeding. That court proceeding is called a tax certiorari review. It's provided for under the real property tax law, and basically it's the court looking at the assessment to determine whether or not it has a rational basis, whether it's properly related to the value, whether it's affected by some impropriety or lack of, you know, proper exemption, things like that. In the past, when those cases were either resolved by the court by way of a judgment or settled by the parties, the school district was responsible for paying the refund that would be due not only on the school taxes but on the library taxes as well. And that was well established by a controller's opinion. In about 2014, the schools, in the dark of night, without talking to the library community at all, got the legislature to pass a bill saying libraries have to pay for their share. So that's been on the books for, quick math, 5 years now. And apparently this fall, Albany City School District discovered it and sent us a letter saying, you need to pay us now.
So we're budgeting that at 50,000 because we think that's based on past years, or
It looks like it's about 100,000 a year.
Yeah, it's going to vary depending on what the certioraries that are filed are. And Karen received a letter and a package of materials asking for our consideration of this. At some point, I need to get a memo to the board sort of outlining the law for you. Part of the problem with this is that they're going to have to communicate with us a little bit more clearly as to what's pending so we can budget for it. But right now, looking at what they've been paying out over the course of a period of time that goes back 3 years, it looks like they're paying out about $100,000 a year in library refunds. I'm surprised the number is as high as it is, and frankly, that may be a factor of the fact that they're not fighting these enough, but we'll have to see.
So we'll take on the fighting them?
That's an interesting question. I doubt very much that it'll be worth your while to do that, but we have to explore whether that's even possible. When the schools first got saddled with this, way back many years ago, one of the things that they did is they had the legislature grant them the authority to go and intervene in these cases, because they don't set the assessment, of course. They don't have any role in that decision. And what was happening is the towns and municipalities and cities who really don't have as big a portion of the tax bill would just go say, all right, we'll fix the assessment. Well, it disproportionately affects the school tax because it's the largest portion of the bill. And so in the real property tax law now, there's a whole bunch of provisions that allow schools to have intervention rights, direct service, things like that. It doesn't say that with respect to libraries, but there may be some arguments that we have those rights through the school tax provisions. There may be some arguments that now this is out there that libraries should be given intervention rights. The problem is that although your bills could be big for you, the chances of any single assessment challenge being large enough to affect you guys in a way that you'd want to spend a lot of money on a lawyer to intervene in a lawsuit, it would have to be a really big taxpayer getting a really big refund.
How many houses in Albany here?
Well, it's much more likely to be a commercial property.
Right.
If you think about it, if it were one of the huge developments coming off of a pilot looking for an Article 7 that you're pulling, $30,000 or $40,000, $50,000 a year out of, and all of a sudden they want to cut that by 2/3, maybe you'd say, wait a second. But even that, frankly, I'd tell you to really think about whether the juice is worth the squeeze. Because even if you're losing $30,000, the chance of me being able to do a whole lot for you in litigation for that money, even if you were successful, litigation's expensive.
Can I ask so it's about $100,000 for just the library portion? Did they give you a breakdown of the properties so
Yeah.
you could see?
Well, do they? They are now. That's one of the problems with this whole thing, is this is just a new issue, right? They've never communicated with us on any of this, but they do it. They have the information. Indeed, as Karen has learned, they're doing this every month on their own agenda.
That's what I was going to say, is that you can go look at the school board agenda and look at, I can't forget what they call it, relative property tax memo, I think is what it's called on the agenda, and you can see what they're paying. So I think this month, or this last meeting, it was $600 for library taxes.
Just like.
I can see $600.
But it varies.
Yeah.
It varies. There's
Well, yeah.
sometimes much larger.
Again, if there's one big settlement, that's going to drive a different number.
It's also going to change based on assessment years. So Albany redid their assessment a year after I moved here, so 4 years ago. So the preceding 2 years it spiked considerably. So Adam and I just have to be careful and aware of when those reassessments are done and just keep an eye on it. And if we know a reassessment's coming, which after the last one, I don't blame the city for never doing it again. We just have to make sure that we have to go, and when we create that budget, we make sure that budget's created in a way that reflects, it's not $100,000, it may be, they had 1 year where it was $175,000, so we just have to be aware of that and keep our fingers on the pulse of what's going on.
And they're not always assessing this tax year, sometimes they're going back.
Yeah.
in time
When
to-
you bring a proceeding, you can join them for 3 years. So it's often a settlement of multiple years, some of which is a refund, some of which is prospective. If all they did was settled it prospectively, there'd never be a refund, but nothing ever moves that quickly. So you often have settlements of 3 years at a time or whatever. So the number seemed high to me too, Sarah, but we do have backup for it. We've had a chance to start looking at it. we'll pay attention. And you can imagine if our number's 100, think of the numbers for them. You know, on our $7 million of tech support, they're talking $112 million of tech support. You know, so yeah, big numbers.
Okay, so more questions on the stub year budget.
It's 2020 budget.
I have to call it stub year. I have one. When do we get our tax levy from the school district? September, October?
By contract, no later than October. I don't know what we had a little weird thing this year that it was a little bit delayed.
It was a little delayed, I believe we get that.
Okay, but we got $8.8 million from them.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's how much we got in tax levy that would be applied to 2020. Yet in the stub budget proposed, the income is reduced to $3.5 million.
That's true.
Where's the rest of that money?
So the branch plan portion of the tax levy, the debt service, so we received that this fall. While it will be paid out in 2020, it's still reported right now in 2019 as unexpensed. That's how we've traditionally handled that portion of the tax levy. So in 2020, we will receive, you can see 1.656 million that will go towards bond payments. Receive that in the fall of 2020, and it will be reported at that time. I've had a long conversation with the auditor that's working with us on this, and Chuck and I today talked about it too, about how to handle that. Right now, the plan is to record that portion of the tax levy in the fall of 2020 in the new fiscal year. Right now, the money we received this past fall is sitting in our debt service account, waiting to be paid out. It doesn't, it's a separate fund, it doesn't factor into the operating fund.
If I may inject in here, the bond payment has specifically 2 payments per year.
Mm-hmm.
The interest is paid on the 6-month term, and then at the final end, it's the principal and interest paid. That's what makes up the $1.6 million. The first 6 months, is just interest is just paid on the bonds.
Okay.
And then the next time, it's principal and interest.
That's partial answer to the branch, to the BIP part, but what about the other $3.5 million? Why isn't that, where does that show up?
Oh, no, that's there. The tax levy, library operations, the 3.576 million, that's half of the 7.153 you see there.
So where's the other 3.5
Well,
million?
we're only doing a 6-month budget.
I understand that, but that money, we already received it, so
Yeah, it's still sitting in the deferral right now.
So that's theoretically the money that's being used to pay for July 1st of this year through
will it become part of the fund
2019.
balance that will fund the operation gap? I just made up that phrase. The fiscal year will start July 1st, and we won't get the tax money from the school district until September, October. So obviously we need some of that money to do that. So, but what I don't understand why it's not showing up.
Because this
It's a
isn't,
budget.
This is a budget, this is not, an accounting of where the money is.
It's a budget, not a balance sheet.
It's not a balance sheet, it's a budget,
Okay.
right?
Right now, at the end of November 30th, there is $4,990,000 sitting on the balance sheet that is to be amortized over the next periods of time until we get such time as we get our new funds in 2020.
For
Okay?
hold right. 4.9 is in which account?
In deferred operations. It's sitting on the balance sheet. That doesn't have anything to do with the operations at this point in time.
So that is
And that money
the
is also sitting in
fund
cash
balance?
in between the checking account and the investment accounts.
Right, our general checking account has over $6 million.
Right.
Okay, so we have a fund balance that we already have that exists. So when you were talking about the I can't even say it.
Yeah,
Can't say it either.
Is that different than the fund balance that we've got?
Well, we're not talking about a balance sheet at all.
Yeah, yeah.
We're not talking about how much money
Okay.
APL has, we're talking about a budget for half a year, that's all, right?
So what was allotted out of that?
So, well, well,
I understand that part, but I wanna know what happened to the other.
well, I mean,
Money.
if you had
Or what's- what
a
the
third
plans are for
column here that said proposed 20, the other half of 21, the first half of 21.
Well, we do have the 2021,
The second half of.
we have that budget, but we're getting a new source of tax levy for that. We're getting more money in September to cover that
Yes,
period.
yes. That's what you can anticipate, yes.
This does not indicate whether we have it or whether we're getting it.
Right.
But it's balancing a budget.
So
Okay.
to her point is, if we had that third column that showed what was happening, for the second half of the year, to June 30th, then that would show the amount that you believe is missing.
It's not, we have we have the next year's budget, that's gonna show up. But I know that it's not missing, I just wanna know what the plans are for it, and if plans are to cover the gap, that's fine, but
It's not to cover the gap, I think you're looking for a balance sheet to tell us, the money that we have for 2020, which we actually get in September of the year, is when we do the balance sheet at the end of the stub year budget, is that gonna include additional funds because we collected early? It's not because when did we switch it to this firm? Where are we with now? I get mixed up. Marvin, we've always recorded some of that money when we received that check. So from my understanding of this is just the budget, so I don't know how to explain it, it's driving me nuts.
I wouldn't even try. What I would suggest that you do is ask Adam to have Bonadio give you a balance sheet and cash flow demonstration, because that's
Okay.
the only way you can possibly see it. It's not just going to show up on a balance sheet. It's going to be in one of those accounts, but you've got to actually show the cash flow for a period of time so you can see that that money, even though it may be associated with a particular budget year, is being spent as it comes in. I mean, it's just flowing through. It's keeping you running. And so they're deferring it on an accounting basis, but the money's just going into the account and just becoming fungible. They're not segregating that stuff specifically. It's just running through that ultimate fund balance on that balance sheet. And this is just the budget, which is why it's not showing it.
Okay,
But I think those documents would show it. I think that would illustrate why.
I'll look at that with you, Karen.
thank you. Any other questions on the stub?
I just have a general question. Are you saying to me that you would prefer that I also provide you with a balance sheet along with the budgeted report? I can do that if you do so. I just didn't think it was necessary because you're always talking about the income and expenses compared to the budget.
So let's have this conversation offline, but I think that we do need to have a conversation about it, so if you could say, maybe you and Sarah and I can talk about it now quickly after the meeting, we can talk about what it is we might need. Thank you.
Can I ask one quick question? Is Alan at Bonadio working with you guys now?
Yes.
So I seem to recall him doing an illustration like this 5 or 6 years ago when he was pushing to make the switch.
Mm-hmm.
And the document was helpful to answer some of the questions.
Great,
Yeah, I think he could redo something like that and it would make a lot more sense.
okay.
Cause the fiscal year is really nothing more than an accounting period,
I
and that's why it's confusing.
Which I'm excited about it. I just trying to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reviewing that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Still catching
thanks.
We're asking.
And remember that none of us are accountants.
And none of you were here for that last discussion, so you haven't
Right.
seen that document. I don't remember specifically how he did it, but it was, I remember the trustee saying, oh, okay.
Cool.
So,
All right. Well, let's put that on the. I don't know. I will still have that conversation with Chuck. Okay.
This needs to be voted.
We need to vote on it. Okay. So budget modification.
It's already been
Maybe second.
approved by the
So
finance
someone who's
committee.
not on finance, I will second it. Or you have to ask me for a second.
Thanks, Jenna.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay. All in favor? Okay. Right. Succession plan for administration. Now, I want to start. I have a recollection that I sent an email about this. I could not find it for the life of me. Did anyone get an email from me about this?
Yes.
Okay.
I remember saying that.
So,
I
Just
remember this. Yeah.
want to make clear this is, like, I did request this. I requested this because Scott had to be out a little bit, and I learned that Melanie was out at the same time, and that happens. I just didn't know who was kind of leading the library when they're both out, so I asked for this. It's not a succession plan specifically, which is that's a completely different thing, but it's in terms of succession of who's in charge, kind of what the order that is. I requested this happen, and thank you for getting it done so quickly. But succession planning is more about kind of a longer term situation, and that's not what we're talking about. Okay, now you can.
No, I mean, you pretty much explained it. I was out of work, which was really weird, and the longest I've been out of work ever in the last 7 years, which freaked everybody out a little bit. And then simultaneously, Melanie had an emergency in her family. So when Karen and I were discussing it, I realized that there really needs to be something clearly in place. We did something like this like 5 years ago, and it drove me nuts that I couldn't find the memo. But it pretty much just comes down to if I'm taken out by spies and then Melanie is kidnapped, then the plan after that is it falls to the head of branches, and whoever's the most senior head of branch is first, then second, then third. So Rebecca, you might take us all out, and then you can take over. Yeah.
What's Rita's advisor defeating you lately?
Yeah.
Apparently hasn't had much time to read.
Yes, I had a lot. I finished a book in a week, which is good for
Read
me.
all that?
So, this is just to kind of give, to me, this is given, but I realize that it's really important for the board to know that there are people who are going to fall in for responsibility if multiple people are out at once. And then, there's a little bit about, and I'm sure Karen and I are going to have a conversation about what happens if Melanie decides she's going to take a leave of absence and go to Paris for 6 months, and then what happens in those positions and how we figure that out. Some of this is kind of drafted in a way so after it's presented to the board, it's going to be presented to the staff. So then, because I know the staff sometimes has the same questions and gets confused about who's in charge when I'm gone or Melanie's gone, and this will, even though it was sent a while ago, we have to resend it. Bob told me it was morbid.
So do you have thoughts on that part, Bob?
I mean, the concepts are the right ones. I think that there's going to be some civil service things that get in the way of that, maybe temporary appointments or whatever, but it's the general gist of things.
Okay. I was just asking about that last section. I really didn't understand what I was doing there, so and we haven't had a conversation about that.
Well, I think what this document will bring up by certain staff members is what happens when Melanie leaves. Does someone fill the slot right away? I don't want people to think that, make assumptions of what's going to happen next.
Right, because this isn't a succession plan for who takes over a job.
Yeah.
This is just who's in charge in case people are not available
So,
temporarily.
may I make a recommendation that we we change the title on this memo?
Sure.
To be chain of command or management structure in
We'll do chain of
access.
responsibility, that
Chain,
resonates a
fine.
little bit better with staff.
And-
Chain of responsibility.
And let's,
Succession is, that's,
Due to extended leave or something
Yeah.
like that.
well, let's, in the first paragraph, when it says unable to fulfill their duties, let's say temporarily unable, because that's part of it too. This is not a long-term plan, this is, what happens in case of emergency. Thank you, Alyssa, that was a great suggestion. Any other comments on this? We're not
This is just the,
voting on it,
yeah, this is
it's an
just the
informational
information item.
item. Okay. 2021 budget, oh gosh, that sounds so weird, 2021 budget.
Out of 20s.
And again, this is just an information item. Adam and I went through this exercise and decided that it would be better to present it to the finance committee before we did any additional work on it, just to give the finance committee an idea of the direction that we were going. So think of this as a very drafty draft. But it was good because it created a lot of conversation about the budget and a lot of questions from the facilities committee, which was extremely helpful, and some suggestions on how we should present it going forward.
The finance committee.
Finance committee.
And the only difference, as Sarah said, is the amount of fund balance used. There's no difference in spending. Any questions on this budget preliminarily, understanding that we're going to have extra time in February to deal with this as well?
There is a change, it's 0.68%.
Sorry, can you explain that?
I think that's the tax that one I'm not gonna be able to pronounce, but
Cert?
tax cert, so there is a 0.68% increase from the originally approved 2020 budget. And I say originally approved as in the 2020 budget that people voted on. There's a decrease in payroll. There's a 3.9% or $28,000 increase in occupancy costs. There's a 1% increase or about $10,000 for materials and services, so Melanie stops harassing me about it. There's a 48% increase in administration and miscellaneous. 100,000 of that is the tax cert cost, and then 62 are some spliced out budget lines that we put in there. And then there's a $50,000 or 17% decrease in information technology, and that's because we moved so in administration and miscellaneous, we moved $50,000 from information technology into administration and miscellaneous because that's the Upper Hudson payments. So we wanted to reflect in administration how much money we pay out to Upper Hudson every year for the ULON agreement.
Question, how do you project a decrease in payroll spending, even though it's tiny, but?
Based completely on, I'll let Adam speak.
Sure, yeah, so the salaries are actually equal to what we originally had in the 2020 budget. The decrease in that section of payroll-related costs came from retirement system and payroll taxes, processing fees. Those numbers were decreased based on the ratios between retirement system salaries and taxes and processing fees and salaries for 2019. We do have those final numbers, so those ratios were used and resulted in a slight decrease.
So every year we've seen a significant amount of savings in that particular budget line, and it's been my goal to be have a margin of error of 3%. So that's where he kind of sharpened his pencil and cleaned his eraser and went through our estimates on everything that has to do with staffing. So again, how much we've budgeted to pay staff hasn't changed. It has more to do with the projections that we have that are rolled into those lines that have to do with benefits like retirement and healthcare.
And that would cause you to have a reduction.
Yes, about 67,000. Our estimates in the past were inaccurate, and they've been inaccurate every year for 5 years.
Interesting.
So, as long as the market continues to move in the direction it's moving, we will always see savings in retirement, and healthcare really fluctuates. But remember that we have the way we structure our healthcare in our CBA, collective bargaining agreement, is that we have a high deductible, but then we have a savings account that we cover those high deductions. So if we have a good year, the director doesn't get shingles, that no one, needs foot surgery or back surgery, all of those things, that account, we end up with savings in that account. But we have had years where we've had multiple staff members max out their HSA, and it's been a little bit higher. So it's a moving target. It's really difficult to predict because you just never know what's going to happen in a year and how many people are going to. My first year we maxed out because Lindsay got foot surgery. So it's all of those factors that, of the 46 staff members that we cover their health insurance.
Sounds about right. I don't know the exact number.
So if everybody has a bad year, we max that account out. But if everybody has a healthy year, we end up, it would be very easy for everybody to save $1,000, and then you're looking at $40,000 right there. When this system was put in place, it was smart. I understand why the union wants to keep it that way. I personally like it this way, but it is probably the biggest negative to doing our healthcare this way is the fact that it's not as predictable that if it was just a straightforward, non-high deductible, non-reimbursed healthcare. At the time, it was more, it saved us from that 25% increase. So it has worked to our advantage. Honestly, it just has made more work for the business office. But we want to sharpen it up and be more accurate.
Since we're on the topic of payroll, did you want to explain what you were explaining to us about how you're thinking of doing when we have staff vacancies and possible overtime instead?
What?
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I think this year we're going to start to track our payrolls a little bit more closely. I mean, as you can see in the budget, we've broken out salaries between full-time and part-timers in the budget, so we can really try and pinpoint exactly where our projections have been off, and obviously overtime as part of that, things like holiday work time, factor into that as well. So we're going to try to start tracking that a bit more closely, and hopefully get more accurate projections as we move throughout the year and beyond.
We've never, and this is, for a municipal organization, it's a little different the way we've done it, and now we're moving towards a more normalized. We've never budgeted for overtime, and we've never been an organization that's offered our blue collar staff or our clerical staff overtime. So we have, in the last year, started to do that because we have such a hard time filling positions that we've come close to not opening branches. So now when it comes to our community engagement clerks, when it comes to snow removal, we have actually said, hey, you know what, we're gonna budget and we're gonna watch this budget, whether or not we can offer people overtime. What we're also starting to do when we do scheduling is start saying to each branch location, this is how many hours you have to schedule your part-time employees. So move towards a more retail model and just say, you've got X amount of clerk hours you can use this month. If you budget correctly and you have extra, that might give you some leeway, but really be on top of it at a more drilled down level, because this is where we continue to see savings at the end of the year. We don't use all of our part-time hours. And then we can at least explain at the end of the year, if there's $100,000 savings in the salary line, Adam and I can at least come and say, it's because Melanie took her sabbatical to Paris and we didn't have to pay her for 6 months. And that's why, we have this much savings. Germany, sorry. Better beer in Germany?
That's what
Doesn't preclude Paris.
we might actually do a little dip into Paris.
Might as well, since you're over there.
So the finance committee has seen this, yes?
We had slightly different numbers when we looked at it. It's been amended since our meeting, but we largely saw this.
Okay, and when you see it, are you also looking at what our expenditures were in 2019? So we've got these budget numbers, we are doing budget mods. So here's the assumption, right? The assumption is that the 2020 budget is on track. This budget assumes that. So two things would help me with that. One is seeing 2019 actuals, right? Or projections. We don't have all the finals. And whether our 2020 budget seems to be on track based on our 2019 actuals. So if you told me those things, then I would take the 2020 budget. But in this case, I don't know if we're near that at all, right?
Yep, that's why it's a drafty draft.
Okay, so,
Tom actually made that proposal via email after our committee meeting.
okay,
That he also wanted to see that as well, and so does Sarah. So,
okay.
And my response to the committee in that email was that we have to wait until,
Right. Okay.
because again, then there's an audit to say whether or not we change the numbers. I don't wanna present one set of numbers,
Right.
and then all of a sudden we get a bill that we realize that we have to put in and it throws the numbers off. But we typically we usually do that. We're actually early in the process. We don't usually provide a draft to the finance committee in January. Adam and I just thought
Yeah,
that it
that's
would be good for our information to get these questions.
Yeah, excellent. Well, and I'm assuming that you're not putting a 2020 budget. You wouldn't, if you thought you were off on some of these, you wouldn't be suggesting them for the next year.
No.
Yeah, certainly once we get the final 2019 numbers in, based on that.
Yeah.
Maybe some changes to this document,
Sure.
so, next month. Okay,
The draft.
yes.
Not the drafty draft.
Yes. Some insulation. Everything works out.
Any other questions on the 2020, 2021 budget?
Just a format recommendation that when we see this again, it would be helpful to have your notey notes next to the drafty draft.
We're gonna actually code it. This was Sarah's suggestion. We're gonna it's gonna be like Battleship.
Sarah Dallas.
Say it's Sarah does, and there'll be codes, and then Sarah shared with us some examples that you can then follow. Because the other problem is if we put our notes next to the lines, we're gonna go back to those giant sheets of paper.
Numerical numbers next to each.
Yeah, we're gonna code them all, so then we can go through the code, like Battleship. A1, A2.
Okay.
I look forward to seeing how that.
You can come to the finance committee meetings.
Is their next finance committee meeting scheduled?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you for that good discussion. Next on the agenda is the public access to library information policy. So, the P&G committee approved one policy revised that needs to be approved by the board. This did not appear on the board docs agenda until this afternoon. So if you would prefer to table this so you have time to review it, that would be very reasonable. If you are okay with our attorney revised it, and I'm sure he could go over the changes, we can do it now. But if you want to wait, we can.
Say that again.
So this
Policy committee did.
we revised the staff and council revised the policy. The P&G committee approved that last week for approval at this meeting. This didn't show up on board docs until 4:15.
This is a hefty policy.
So we can table that till next month.
Do you wanna give us a heads up on what was changed?
It's not as easy as it sounds,
Okay.
because what we worked off of was something that had been changed. And so I made a lot of changes to the document that I had in front of me, but I think that document had changes in it. I don't think, frankly, this deviates much from your existing policy, other than it's formatted to be a little bit more easy reading. and it's simplified in a couple places with respect to how fees are determined and how appeals are handled. But it is not a substantive change in any way from what you have now.
There's also a subject matter list.
That's true. We did finally comply with the law and create the subject matter list, which is in Appendix A. I didn't do that, someone else did it, and they did a very nice job. And there's also a FOIL request form that's appended, even though that's not required and you don't have to use a form to make a FOIL request. We're trying to be user-friendly as always, and there's a form there.
I would like to read it, and I can't do that tonight, so maybe we should table it.
Sarah, you had raised your hand.
Oh yeah, I had just gone back to the committee meeting minutes and it said the 2 appendixes. I was just trying to figure out if there was anything more than that was changed.
Well, there was changes that Bob made, and then we made some minor edits at the meeting.
Is there, could you send us a copy with track changes or something that's, no, it's
No,
okay.
because we did it off of a different document.
Got it.
We
I could compare this to what's the existing,
Interesting one, yeah.
but I think the problem you're gonna find is the formatting is gonna be the primary changes, so
It's gonna look
it
all
won't look great.
crazy, but we could certainly send the old version.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, I can try and run a compare. I just think that they're gonna be, the biggest changes are gonna be the formatting ones, and so that makes the document sideways.
Alright, so that'll go to next month. Next up is public comment, and what did I wanted to say something, it's not in the agenda. About the school district. We had talked about, just the school district, board meetings. We had talked about having a representative, for, like a liaison with the school board. And I think that's, the way that's phrased overstates it. It would be great if someone would volunteer just to look at the board agenda. They have board docs, it's just as straightforward, and see if there's anything there that's relevant. Because I did that last week, and there was a lot that was relevant. And some of it, and I didn't know about. For example, they had a new plan for this building. And so, if you are willing to do it, that's great. It just, they meet, every 2 weeks, approximately, a lot. But it just looking and seeing what's on the agenda to make sure there's anything that we should be aware of. The tax certs, that's how I start looking through it. Oh, there they are. Look, they were there every month. Okay.
Some
Well,
weeks I don't look, and then people will be like, did you hear what happened to James? How does everybody know about it?
well, you only need to report the library relevant stuff. We don't need to know what happened to
I
James.
should be looking to.
Okay, well that.
Oh, I wanna know what happened to James.
After
Believe
That's
it or
it.
not, shingles?
That channel's very popular right now.
But you could have read the agenda, not known beforehand what was about to happen to James.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you. Okay, so public comment, no public comment. We don't need an executive session today, so we're ready to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? Matthew? Okay, all in favor? Great. Thanks, everybody.